HOA tried to ban my ranch bonfires, didn't know I'm chief of the fire department. The flames from my bonfire reflected off Margaret Whitman's face as she stood 20 feet away, clutching a clipboard like it was some kind of sacred weapon. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed at my property line, while her mouth moved in what I could only describe as a furious whisper scream to the other HOA board members flanking her. What she didn't know was that in exactly 48 hours, that same clipboard would be nothing but ash, and her precious HOA would be scrambling to avoid the biggest legal catastrophe in Willow Creek Estate's 15-year history. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to where this whole mess started, because you need to understand just how far Margaret Whitman was willing to go to destroy my family's 100-year tradition. And more importantly, you need to understand exactly who she was messing with. 3 months earlier, I'd been chief of the Willow Creek Fire Department for 8 years. My great-grandfather had built our ranch house in 1923, long before there was even a neighborhood around us, let alone an HOA. The Whitman family? They'd moved in 2 years ago from some gated community in California, bringing with them an attitude that could sour milk and a mission to turn our quiet Texas neighborhood into their personal kingdom. The first bonfire of the season should have been perfect. October nights in Texas have this crisp edge that makes you want to gather around a fire with your family, roast marshmallows, and forget about the world for a while. My 8-year-old daughter, Emma, had been looking forward to it for weeks, asking me daily if it was bonfire weather yet. My wife, Sarah, had already bought the s'mores supplies and invited her sister's family over from Houston. I'd built our fire pit the same way my grandfather had taught me, 20 feet from any structure, surrounded by a proper stone ring with a water source nearby. Everything by the book, both for tradition and for obvious professional reasons. But apparently, that wasn't good enough for Margaret Whitman. The knock on my door came at exactly 7:43 p.m. on that first Friday night in October. I remember the time because I'd just checked my watch, wondering if the fire had burned down enough to start roasting marshmallows. Emma was practically bouncing with excitement, and my brother-in-law, Jake, was telling one of his infamous ghost stories when the sharp rap 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 echoed from our front porch. Sarah shot me a look. Expecting someone? I shook my head and walked to the door, already knowing in my gut that whatever waited on the other side was going to ruin our perfect family evening. Margaret Whitman stood on my porch like she owned it, flanked by 2 other HOA board members I'd seen around but never actually met. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful, and she wore a navy blazer despite the warm evening. In her hands was a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. "Chief Rodriguez," she said, though her tone suggested the title tasted bitter in her mouth. "I'm Margaret Whitman, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I believe you know why we're here." I honestly didn't. "I'm afraid I don't, Mrs. Whitman. Is there some kind of emergency?" Her laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Emergency? That depends on how you define putting the entire neighborhood at risk with your recreational activities." Behind me, I could hear Emma asking Sarah why the fun had stopped. My daughter's innocent question lit something fierce in my chest, but I kept my voice level. "Mrs. Whitman, I'm going to need you to be more specific. Your bonfires, Chief Rodriguez. They're a violation of HOA Regulation 15.3.7, which prohibits open flames on residential property except for approved barbecue equipment." She opened the folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. "This is your formal notice of violation. You have 72 hours to extinguish that fire and remove any fire-making materials from your property." The paper felt surreal in my hands. I'd dealt with plenty of bureaucratic nonsense in my years as fire chief, but this was a new level of absurd. "Mrs. Whitman, with all due respect, my family has been having bonfires on this property since before your neighborhood existed. This land was grandfathered in when the paper felt surreal in my hands. I dealt with plenty of bureaucratic nonsense in my years as fire chief, but this was a new level of absurd. Mrs. Whitman, with all due respect, my family has been having bonfires on this property since before your neighborhood existed. This land was grandfathered in when nothing was grandfathered in, Chief. The interruption was sharp and final. When you chose to join this HOA community, you agreed to abide by all regulations, regardless of previous traditions. The way she said traditions made it sound like something you'd scrape off your shoe. I never chose to join anything, I said, my professional calm starting to crack. Your HOA was formed around existing properties. We were never given a choice. Margaret's smile was all teeth and no warmth. The county records show otherwise. Your signature is on the agreement documents from 2019. That stopped me cold. In 2019, I'd been dealing with my father's estate after he passed away, transferring the property into my name. There had been a mountain of paperwork, and I'd trusted the lawyers to handle the details. The possibility that I'd unknowingly signed away my family's rights made my stomach drop. I'll need to review those documents, I managed. Of course. You have 72 hours. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Chief Rodriguez? Any violation of this notice will result in daily fines of $500, plus legal fees. I do hope it doesn't come to that. As their car disappeared down our gravel drive, I stood in my doorway holding that piece of paper like it might explode. Behind me, Emma's voice cut through my stunned silence. Daddy, can we make s'mores now? I turned around to see my family's expectant faces illuminated by the firelight. Sarah's eyes were full of questions I didn't have answers to. Jake looked confused, and Emma was still holding her marshmallow stick like a magic wand, waiting for the adventure to continue. You bet, sweetheart, I said, forcing a smile. Let's make the best s'mores ever. But as we roasted marshmallows and tried to salvage our family time, my mind was already racing ahead to what Margaret Whitman had just set in motion. She wanted to play legal games with a fire chief on his own property? Fine, but she had no idea what she'd just started. The next morning, I was at the county courthouse before it opened, coffee in hand, and that HOA document burning a hole in my jacket pocket. Betty Chen, the county clerk, had been dealing with property records longer than I'd been alive, and she greeted me with the kind of smile that said she'd already heard about my visitor the night before. Let me guess, she said, before I could even speak. Margaret Whitman paid you a visit. I shouldn't have been surprised. In a town of 8,000 people, news traveled faster than wildfire, especially when it involved HOA drama. You've heard this story before? Betty's laugh was grim. Honey, you're the 7th property owner she's gone after this year. The Hendersons on Maple Street, the young couple with the vegetable garden on Oak, the Patels who had the audacity to paint their front door blue instead of beige. She shook her head. That woman's got a mission, and it's not making the neighborhood a nicer place to live. What happened to the others? Most of them folded. Paid the fines, made the changes, kept their heads down. The Hendersons fought for 3 months before they gave up and moved to the next county over. Betty pulled out a thick file folder. But you're different, aren't you? I wasn't sure what she meant, but something in her tone made me think she wasn't just talking about my job. How so? Well, for starters, you actually know what you're doing when it comes to fire safety. And second, she leaned forward conspiratorially. Margaret Whitman made a very big mistake when she messed with you. Betty spread the documents across the counter like she was dealing cards. The property deed, the HOA formation documents, the county records from 2019. As I read through them, a clearer picture started to emerge, and with it, the first hints of a plan that Margaret Whitman would never see coming. She was right about one thing, Betty said quietly. Your signature is on the HOA agreement. But what she didn't tell you is that the agreement she's using is the updated version from 2022, not the original one you signed. My head snapped up. What's the difference? The original version had a grandfather clause for existing fire pits and recreational fires. The 2022 version removed that protection. Betty's finger traced a line on the older document. According to county law, any changes to HOA regulations that affect existing, legal property uses require written consent from affected homeowners. Did you ever receive notification of this change? I thought back through 3 years of mail. HOA newsletters, property tax notifications, junk mail by the pound. But a formal notice about regulation changes? No, nothing. Betty's smile was sharp enough to match Margaret Whitman's. Then, Chief Rodriguez, I believe you have grounds to challenge not just the violation, but the entire updated regulation. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt like I was carrying dynamite instead of paperwork. But Margaret Whitman wasn't going to wait for me to lawyer up. That afternoon, she escalated in a way that would have been funny if it wasn't so infuriating. The citation appeared on my windshield while I was inside the grocery store. Not on my property, not even in my neighborhood, but in the public parking lot of Miller's Market where I'd stopped to pick up dinner. The bright orange paper flapped in the breeze like a surrender flag, but the message was pure declaration of war. NOTICEOFADDITIONALV IOLAATION accumulation of fire, starting materials in personal vehicle constitutes preparation for prohibited activity. Fine, $500. Next violation, $1,000. I stared at the citation, then at the back of my pickup truck, which contained exactly what it had contained every day for the past 8 years. Emergency response equipment, including fire blankets, extinguishers, and yes, road flares. Standard equipment for any fire chief, and completely legal to transport. But Margaret Whitman wasn't interested in legal. She was interested in control. The next violation notice appeared 2 days later, taped to my mailbox. This time, she'd cited me for suspicious smoke emissions from my chimney on a 40-degree morning when I'd made pancakes for Emma before school. The fine, another $500. The fourth notice was waiting on my desk at the fire station, hand-delivered while I was out on a call. Someone had complained about the excessive noise from my morning jogging routine, claiming it disturbed the peace at 6 a.m. $500 more, plus a warning that continued disruption of neighborhood tranquility would result in legal action. By the end of the week, Margaret Whitman had managed to rack up over $2,000 in fines against me for living my normal life on my own property. But what she didn't realize was that each ridiculous citation was actually helping me build a case that would destroy not just her harassment campaign, but potentially her entire power structure. That Friday evening, exactly 1 week after her first visit, Margaret Whitman made her biggest mistake yet. She came back with reinforcements. This time, there were 5 of them. Margaret led the group like a general leading troops into battle, flanked by her usual board members, plus 2 people I didn't recognize carrying official-looking clipboards and cameras. They marched across my property line without permission, heading straight for my fire pit like they owned the place. I was in my garage, working on replacing the brake pads on Sarah's car, when Emma came running in with tears in her eyes. "Daddy, there are people in our yard and they're taking pictures of our fireplace." I dropped my wrench and walked outside to find Margaret Whitman directing what looked like a professional photo shoot of my fire pit. One of the strangers was measuring distances with a laser device, while the other documented everything with a camera that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "Mrs. Whitman," I called out, my voice carrying the authority I used at emergency scenes. "You're on private property without permission. I need you to leave, now." She didn't even look up from her clipboard. Actually, Chief Rodriguez, We're conducting an official HOA safety inspection as outlined in Regulation 23.4.2. As a member of this community, you're required to allow reasonable access for compliance verification. I'm required to do nothing of the sort. This is private property, and you don't have a warrant or my consent. That got her attention. She looked up with that same condescending smile I was learning to hate. Oh, but I do have consent. From the county fire marshal's office. She handed me a document that made my blood pressure spike into dangerous territory. It was an official form signed by Fire Marshal Davidson himself, authorizing an inspection of my property for potential fire hazards. But what made it truly infuriating was the reason listed for the inspection: multiple complaints received regarding unsafe fire practices at residential property. Davidson was a good man and a competent fire marshal, but he was also a political appointee who avoided conflict whenever possible. If multiple complaints had reached his office about a fire chief's property, he'd have no choice but to investigate, even if those complaints were completely fabricated. This is harassment, Mrs. Whitman, and we both know it. Her smile widened. This is public safety, Chief Rodriguez. Surely you, of all people, understand the importance of ensuring fire safety compliance. I watched helplessly as her team continued their inspection, taking photos of my legally compliant fire pit from every conceivable angle. They measured distances to structures, documented the stone ring construction, and even took samples of ash from previous fires. Every action was technically legal under the marshal's authorization, and every action was designed to make me feel powerless on my own property. But Margaret Whitman had just made a crucial error. By involving the fire marshal's office and claiming multiple safety complaints, she'd escalated this from a civil HOA dispute to an official fire safety matter. And fire safety? That was my domain. As her team packed up their equipment, Margaret approached me with one final surprise. Chief Rodriguez, I wanted to let you know that we'll be presenting our findings to the county commissioners next Tuesday evening. Given the severity of the safety violations we've documented, we'll be requesting emergency injunctive relief to prevent any further fire-related activities on your property pending a full investigation. An emergency injunction. She was trying to use the legal system to ban my family's bonfire tradition permanently, making it a criminal offense to light so much as a match on my own land. "See you Tuesday evening," she said, climbing into her car. "I do hope you'll be there to present your side of the story." As her convoy disappeared down my driveway, I stood in my yard, surrounded by the evidence of their invasion: disturbed ground around the fire pit, stakes in the lawn where they'd taken measurements, even a few scattered papers from their documentation process. My property looked like it had been processed by a crime scene investigation unit. Emma appeared beside me, slipping her small hand into mine. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" I looked down at my daughter's worried face and made a decision that would change everything. Margaret Whitman wanted to play games with fire safety regulations? Fine. But she'd chosen to challenge the one person in the county who knew those regulations better than anyone else alive. "No, sweetheart," I told Emma, squeezing her hand. "We're not in trouble. But some other people are about to be." That weekend, I did something I'd never done before in my 8 years as fire chief. I spent 2 solid days diving deep into every fire safety regulation, county ordinance, and legal precedent I could find. Not just the obvious ones that everyone knew about, but the obscure technical requirements that most people never bothered to read. What I found was better than I dared to hope. The County Fire Code, Section 15.7.3, required all residential properties in designated fire risk areas to maintain defensible space around structures. Willow Creek Estates, with its abundant oak trees and native grass, definitely qualified as a fire risk area. The required defensible space? 30 feet of cleared ground around any structure, with specific vegetation management requirements. Margaret Whitman's house, like most in the HOA, was surrounded by decorative landscaping that violated these requirements in at least 6 different ways. Ornamental shrubs within 10 feet of the structure. Wooden mulch beds adjacent to the foundation. Overhanging tree branches within 15 feet of the roofline. Each violation carried a potential fine of up to $1,000 per day until corrected. But that was just the beginning. As I dug deeper into the regulations, I discovered that HOA common areas were subject to even stricter requirements. The decorative pavilion at the neighborhood entrance, built within the county-mandated setback from the main road. The community garden with its wooden raised beds, constructed with untreated lumber that didn't meet fire-resistant standards. The playground equipment surrounded by bark chips instead of approved ground cover. Every single one of these violations had been in place since the HOA's formation, and every single one should have been caught by the county inspection process. But they hadn't been, which meant someone had either failed to do their job or deliberately overlooked the problems. Monday morning, I made a call that would set everything in motion. Davidson, the fire marshal, answered on the second ring. "Bill, it's Rodriguez. I need to talk to you about those complaints you received about my property." There was a long pause. "Jake, I'm sorry about that. I know it's bullshit, but when multiple complaints come in about a fire chief's property..." He trailed off. "How many complaints exactly?" 7 different people, all from your neighborhood. All claiming they'd witnessed unsafe fire practices, excessive smoke, potential fire hazards." Another pause. "Jake, between you and me, the complaints were so detailed and consistent, it was like they were reading from the same script. Coordinated, organized, fabricated. Everything I'd suspected about Margaret Whitman's campaign was confirmed. Bill, I need you to do me a favor. I need you to schedule a comprehensive fire safety inspection of Willow Creek Estates. Not just my property, but the entire development. Jake, I can't just..." "You can if there's evidence of systematic fire code violations throughout the development." "Which there is." I opened my file folder and started reading violations. By the time I'd gotten through half the list, Davidson was taking notes. "Jesus, Jake. How did we miss all of this?" "Because nobody was looking. But I'm looking now, and what I'm seeing could shut down the entire HOA pending compliance." I let that sink in. Bill, Margaret Whitman opened this door when she made it about fire safety. Now I'm walking through it. Tuesday evening arrived with unseasonably warm weather and humidity that made everyone irritable. The county commissioners' meeting was packed, with nearly half the HOA showing up to support Margaret's crusade against my dangerous bonfires. She'd clearly been busy turning what should have been a simple property dispute into a neighborhood cause CL. I arrived early and took a seat in the back row, watching neighbors I'd known for years file in with expressions ranging from concerned to hostile. Some nodded politely in my direction, but most avoided eye contact entirely. Margaret Whitman had done her work well, painting me as a reckless danger to the community. Margaret herself sat in the front row, surrounded by her board members and wearing a red blazer that screamed authority. She'd prepared a presentation, complete with poster boards showing photographs from her inspection and what looked like professional charts documenting alleged safety violations. But what Margaret didn't know was that Fire Marshal Davidson was sitting 3 rows behind her, and he wasn't there to support her case. Commissioner Patricia Hayes called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m. "We're here tonight to consider a petition for emergency injunctive relief filed by the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association regarding alleged fire safety violations at 247 Ranch Road." Margaret stood up like she'd been launched from her chair. "Thank you, Commissioner Hayes. What we're dealing with here is a clear and present danger to our entire community. For the next 20 minutes, Margaret Whitman delivered a presentation that would have been impressive if it hadn't been complete fiction. She talked about excessive smoke emissions and uncontrolled burning and refusal to comply with safety regulations. She showed photographs that made my modest fire pit look like an industrial furnace and presented testimony from neighbors who claimed to fear for their lives every time I lit a match. It was a masterful performance, and I could see the commissioners being swayed by her apparent expertise and obvious preparation. By the time she finished, the room felt decidedly hostile toward the reckless fire chief who was endangering their community. "Chief Rodriguez," Commissioner Hayes said, "would you like to respond to these allegations?" I stood up, walked to the front of the room, and set my own folder on the podium. But instead of opening it, I looked directly at Margaret Whitman. "Mrs. Whitman, you've made this about fire safety. You've involved the fire marshal's office, filed official complaints, and demanded emergency action based on alleged safety violations." I paused. "I think that's an excellent idea." Her confident smile flickered, but she recovered quickly. "I'm glad you agree that safety should be our priority." "Absolutely. In fact, I was so inspired by your commitment to fire safety that I've asked Fire Marshal Davidson to conduct a comprehensive safety inspection of our entire community." I opened my folder and pulled out the first violation report. "Bill, would you like to present your findings?" Fire Marshal Davidson stood up, and suddenly, Margaret Whitman's red blazer didn't look quite so authoritative. "Thank you, Chief Rodriguez. Commissioners, over the past 3 days, I've conducted a thorough inspection of the Willow Creek Estates development, focusing on compliance with county fire safety regulations." He opened his own, much thicker folder. "I'm afraid what I found raises serious questions about the safety of this entire community." What followed was 25 minutes of devastating testimony that systematically demolished every argument Margaret had made. Davidson presented violation after violation, each one documented with the same photographic precision Margaret had used against me. The decorative landscaping that created fire hazards, the community structures built without proper permits, the blocked emergency access routes, the non-compliant electrical installations in the community pavilion. But the real bombshell came when Davidson reached the end of his presentation. "Commissioners, the most serious violation I discovered involves the HOA's own fire safety equipment. County Regulation 12.8. One requires all residential developments with more than 50 units to maintain certified fire suppression equipment and emergency response protocols." He pulled out a final document. "Willow Creek Estates has never filed the required safety plan, never installed the mandated suppression equipment, and never conducted the required emergency drills." The room had gone completely silent. Margaret Whitman's face had progressed through several shades of red and was now approaching purple. "What does that mean, practically speaking?" Commissioner Hayes asked. Davidson looked directly at Margaret. "It means that until these violations are corrected, I'm required by law to recommend that the county issue a cease and desist order for all HOA activities, including board meetings, community events, and enforcement actions." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the air conditioning cycling on. Furthermore, Davidson continued, "Given the coordinated nature of the false complaints filed against Chief Rodriguez, I'm forwarding this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential criminal harassment and filing false reports." Margaret Whitman stood up so fast her chair fell over. "This is outrageous. This is clearly retaliation for legitimate safety concerns." "Mrs. Whitman," Commissioner Hayes said quietly, "I suggest you sit down and consult with an attorney before you say anything else." But Margaret was beyond reason. "You can't shut down an entire HOA over technical violations. We have rights. We have procedures." "You had procedures," I said, standing up, "but you chose to abandon them when you decided to harass a county employee with fabricated complaints and illegal property inspections. That's when Margaret Whitman made her final, fatal mistake. Instead of sitting down and keeping quiet, she turned to face the room full of her neighbors and made an announcement that would be repeated in local coffee shops for months to come. Fine. If you people are too stupid to see that Rodriguez is a danger to this community, then maybe you deserve to have your houses burned down. The room erupted. Neighbors who had been supporting her campaign suddenly found themselves questioning everything they'd been told. Commissioner Hayes gavelled for order, but the damage was done. Margaret Whitman had just revealed her true colors in front of half the neighborhood and the county's governing body. "Mrs. Whitman," Commissioner Hayes said when the room finally quieted, "this meeting is adjourned. I strongly suggest you retain legal counsel." As people filed out, I found myself surrounded by neighbors offering apologies and handshakes. The Hendersons, who had moved away to escape Margaret's harassment, had driven back for the meeting and were openly crying with relief. The young couple with the vegetable garden thanked me for standing up when they couldn't afford to. But the most satisfying moment came as I was packing up my documents. Margaret Whitman approached me one last time, her perfectly controlled facade finally cracked. "This isn't over, Rodriguez." I looked up at her. This woman, who had spent weeks trying to destroy my family's traditions and turned my neighbors against me, and I smiled. "Yes, Mrs. Whitman, it is." The aftermath unfolded over the next month like a slow-motion avalanche, and Margaret Whitman found herself buried under consequences she never saw coming. The district attorney's investigation moved faster than anyone expected. When they subpoenaed Margaret's email records, they discovered not just the coordinated complaint campaign against me, but evidence of similar harassment against 6 other families. The fabricated safety complaints, the coordinated neighbor testimonies, even a detailed strategy document outlining how to use legal technicalities to force undesirable residents out of the neighborhood. The false reporting charges were filed first, followed by criminal harassment charges for the systematic campaign against multiple families. But the real surprise came when the investigation uncovered financial irregularities in the HOA's accounts. Margaret had been padding her contractor invoices and skimming money from the Community Maintenance Fund for 2 years. 3 weeks after the county commissioners' meeting, Margaret Whitman was arrested at her own front door, led away in handcuffs while her neighbors watched from their windows. The sight of her being loaded into the back of a sheriff's car was captured on someone's doorbell camera and quickly became the most watched video in our county's Facebook groups. The HOA itself collapsed within days. With Margaret facing criminal charges and the organization under a county cease and desist order, the remaining board members resigned en masse. The management company terminated their contract, and the community's lawyers advised anyone who would listen to distance themselves from the entire mess as quickly as possible. But the most satisfying consequence was personal. Without the HOA's legal standing, all of Margaret's violation notices became worthless pieces of paper. The thousands of dollars in fines she'd assessed? Legally meaningless. The emergency injunction she'd sought? Dismissed with prejudice. 2 months later, on the first truly cold night of the year, I built the biggest bonfire my family had ever seen. Emma invited half her class. Sarah's entire book club showed up, and neighbors I'd barely spoken to before brought their own families and lawn chairs. The Hendersons drove back from their new home in the next county over, and I watched their kids roast marshmallows with the kind of joy that comes from being free to be yourself on your own property. The young couple with the vegetable garden brought homegrown tomatoes and stories of their first successful harvest without HOA interference. As the fire burned down to glowing coals and the crowd began to thin, I found myself standing next to Fire Marshal Davidson, both of us watching the flames with professional appreciation. "You know," he said quietly, "Margaret Whitman could have avoided all of this if she'd just left you alone." I thought about that for a moment, watching the sparks rise up into the clear Texas night sky. Some people can't help themselves, Bill. They see someone living peacefully and they just can't stand it. Well, she's got plenty of time to think about it now. The preliminary hearing had set her trial date for the following spring, with charges that could result in significant jail time. You going to keep having these bonfires? I looked around at my neighbors, at Emma, showing the younger kids how to make the perfect s'more, at Sarah, laughing with friends by the warmth of our family fire. Every chance I get. As the last guests were leaving, a car I didn't recognize pulled up our driveway. For a moment, old habits kicked in, and I tensed, wondering if Margaret had somehow managed to stir up more trouble from her jail cell. But it was just a young family I'd never met before, looking nervous and hopeful. The father approached cautiously, holding his wife's hand, while two small children peeked out from behind their parents. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you Chief Rodriguez? The one who, with the HOA situation?" I nodded, not sure what to expect. "We're the Johnsons. We just bought Margaret Whitman's house." His wife stepped forward, smiling. "We wanted to ask, would it be okay if we joined you for the next bonfire? Our kids have never seen one, and we heard yours are pretty special." I looked at this young family, new to our neighborhood and clearly hoping to fit in, and I thought about all the families Margaret Whitman had tried to drive away with her harassment and control. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," I said, extending my hand, "you're always welcome at our fires. We have them the first Friday night of every month, weather permitting." As they drove away with promises to see us next month, Emma appeared at my side, still sticky with marshmallow residue and grinning with satisfaction. "Daddy, this was the best bonfire ever." I put my arm around my daughter and looked out over our property, our neighborhood, our community that was finally free to be what it should have been, all along a place where people could live peacefully without fear of harassment or persecution for maintaining their family tradition. Yes, sweetheart. I think it was. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a warm orange light across our land. In a few hours, those embers would be cold ash, but the tradition would continue. My great-grandfather's fire pit would keep bringing families together, keep creating memories, keep defying anyone who thought they could control how we lived our lives on our own property. Margaret Whitman had wanted to ban my ranch bonfires, but she hadn't known she was messing with the fire chief. More importantly, she hadn't understood that some things, family traditions, community bonds, the simple right to live peacefully on your own land, are worth fighting for. As I stomped out the last of the embers and secured the fire pit for the night, I was already looking forward to next month's fire. Because some traditions don't just survive attempts to destroy them, they come back stronger, bringing the whole community together in the process. And that's a kind of revenge that burns forever.